This meeting is being recorded.
Evening all. So yeah, welcome to another evening of learning, I suppose. And this one, as you can see from the screen, this is on heart rate variability. And Marco Altini from the app HRV4Training has really kindly agreed to join us tonight to give us like some real in-depth knowledge on how this metric can be used for triathlon training and health in general. I think that'll probably be one of the big topics. So there's probably quite a few non-total triathletes watching. So anyone that's sort of picked this link up off social media, who are we? We are a triathlon coaching business based in the UK, but we've sort of got athletes spreading across Europe at the moment. On the call tonight, we've got myself and Tony. We're based up in the Northwest. We're joined by Kit and Kirsty. These guys were the sort of instigators of this relationship with HRV4Training. In recent times, Kirsty is an ambassador for them and has been using this with their athletes as well as for her own training. So that's great to have, like, you know, such a direct link between the two companies. I know from my personal use, I've used this app myself for many years. I use it with my athletes. It links great into a lot of the software that we use, like Training Peaks, with our athletes, and provides some really good insight. I won't go too deep into what it's providing. Marco's here to do that for us. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Marco, and let you take it away. Us guys might jump in with some questions if that's okay, and we'll certainly, what we would encourage the audience to do on Zoom is feel free to use the chat method, the chat box, fire us any questions over, and we'll sort of accumulate them for the end to go back to Marco with some questions.
All right, thank you so much. Just quickly, how much time do we have? About an hour or a bit less?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, you've heard a bit about me. I just want to say I have a mixed background between computer science and sports science. So I developed this technology, but then also went back to study more of the physiology and try to combine these two worlds so that we can make more sense of the data we collect. That's a bit what I've been doing with this small business I run, HRV4Training, as well as helping other companies like Aura, which makes a ring to measure physiology during the night. I'll talk a bit about that as well. I teach here at VU Amsterdam. And yeah, I've mostly been doing research at the intersection of these fields. Starting about 12, 13 years ago, developing this thing, which you could connect to the first Android phone to get ECG data on the phone and start collecting some of the data from external sensors. That was before wearables, of course. Now things are a bit easier. This the app we make, the technology that I've developed a couple of years ago, just to collect high quality heart rate variability data using the phone, so without the need of any external sensors. And later I'll talk a bit more about data acquisition and how to get good data also with other systems. In brief, today I want to talk a bit about the physiology first. I think that's always important to try to understand what are we capturing and why that is relevant for health and performance. Then a bit about the technology, so to get a bit more practical on how to collect this data. Guidelines, so even with good sensors and good technology, HRV is something that we need to acquire according to certain guidelines to make sure we collect data that is representative of what we care about. And that's something also I'll talk about today, together with a bit of data analysis and how to interpret the data, and case studies, of course, to show you what type of data you can collect and how you can use it also in the context of adjusting training. The context, I think, is always very important when we talk about heart rate variability. You can measure it in many different times of the day in response to many different stressors. What we care about here when we talk about HRV in this talk, or in general with the tools that we make or many other wearables out there, is HRV in the context of assessing baseline physiological stress. So this means that this is a stress level that is impacted by high intensity training or sickness or intercontinental travel, or sort of significant stressors. But we don't care about small transitory stressors like having coffee or light physical activity or anything that happens during the day. This is important because HRV can be used to study how we respond to different stressors acutely, measuring before or after these stressors. That is not really what we are interested in here. We are really interested in understanding how our body is responding to all of the stressors that have an impact on us, and how we can use that information in the context of training or just health. So that's key here, because otherwise it's difficult to even understand what are we talking about when we talk about HRV, as it is a metric simply representative of the response of the body to any stressor, both acutely and chronically. So what is heart rate variability? If we go to look at it, let's say from a technical point of view, this a few seconds of ECG, so electrical activity of the heart. We can see that between consecutive beats, the time differs. It's not always the same. So that is what we quantify, these differences in consecutive heartbeats. And we care about that for reasons that I'll explain later, but technically that's what these systems do, both with optical methods, with cameras, or with other sensors that use optical sensing, and as well as with ECG and all our straps and anything that can capture beat-to-beat data is used to quantify these differences between consecutive beats. And these differences are due to how the autonomic nervous system impacts heart activity. And in particular, if we did not have the autonomic nervous system, the heart would beat at about 100 beats per minute. So the heart has a pacemaker in the sinoatrial node, and that is how it beats at about 100 beats per minute, constantly without any variability. If you measure your heart rate, you know that most likely it's not always 100 beats per minute. At rest, it's going to be much lower. If you train, it's going to be a lot lower. And that is due to how the autonomic nervous system slows down heart rate at rest, in particular the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, the one in charge of rest and recovery, is slowing down your heart rate and increasing the variability between heartbeats. So that is what we quantify, especially at rest. This is the parasympathetic system is the only one that is active. Basically, the sympathetic system has very small influence. So what we measure with heart rate variability is the impact of the parasympathetic system on heart activity, which is what causes, again, a very significant reduction in heart rate at rest with respect to the sinoatrial node, and also increased variability between beats. There are many different studies that have shown how this phenomenon occurs, basically taking different drugs that inhibit one branch or the other or of the parasympathetic or the sympathetic nervous system. So that you start, for example, at rest with a heart rate of about 60, and then you basically disable the parasympathetic nervous system, and then your heart rate jumps back up to 110. And then you inhibit also the sympathetic nervous system, and you get to this heart rate of the sinoatrial node, about 100. So this tells us that the parasympathetic nervous system is predominant because there is the biggest change when we inhibit basically that branch, so that heart rhythm is not impacted by these changes. All right, so we've seen that parasympathetic activity is predominant at rest, and that causes heart rate to be much lower and HRV to be much higher than how it would be if we had only the intrinsic firing rate of the sinoatrial node. Why do we care about this? Well, the autonomic nervous system is responding to stress. So as we face a stressor, parasympathetic activity, for example, is suppressed, and therefore its influence on heart rhythm reflects the stressor. So this is a simple, non-invasive way to capture how we respond to stressors. basically a suppression in HRV is reflected is reflective of suppression in parasympathetic activity, and therefore of increased physiological stress. We can oversimplify a lot. We will see later that this maybe not the ideal way to always look at the data, but in principle, when we have a higher heart rate variability, it means we have higher parasympathetic activity and less stress, and the other way around when we have lower HRV and therefore more stress. This is still the basic principle behind measuring HRV as a measure of internal load in response to various stressors that we face. Another aspect that I think is relevant is why now, or in other words, why is this more common now? Since there is nothing new in how the body works in response to stress. This has been investigated for more than 50 years already. I think mostly now we just have much easier way to collect this data. We don't need to go to the lab. We can just use our phone. At the same time, there is more consensus on how to compute HRV. There are many different ways to do it, but most tools today do it in the same way, which I think is good for consistency and also between research and the tools that are used in applied settings. And since it is easier to collect the data, we can start to finally look at how things change over time in response to different stressors, instead of doing what was done before, which was basically just to compare different groups of people and maybe see differences in cardiac activity between people that had cardiovascular disease and people that are healthy. So obviously there are differences there, but that's not maybe so insightful. What is more insightful is how is your physiology changing when there is a strong source of stress. For example, here we have someone that got sick, and we can see a large suppression in HRV, so a large stressor, and in this case also an equally large, I would say, change in resting heart rate in the other direction. So these are the things that we can capture now easily thanks to the technology that makes it, again, much easier to collect longitudinal data over time. I want to show you a few examples of acute stressors. So these strong stressors that have a clear impact on the body that typically we can isolate, even though normally, obviously in life, many stressors happen any day. So it's not always so easy to isolate a single stressor, but if we take a long period of time, we can typically try to look into this kind of responses. Here, this is all data that we have published recently. This is the paper if you want to look it up. The data was collected using HRV4Training, so morning measurements of resting physiology, and then through a questionnaire, self-reported stressors, like, for example, training intensity and training load. Here, I want to show you one of the main reasons why we use HRV, right? I said, okay, it is representative of physiological stress, but we know that also heart rate is representative of physiological stress. So why would we go through the trouble of using HRV instead of just resting heart rate? Typically, we do that because HRV is more sensitive than heart rate to stress. Here we have two plots. On the left, we have the change in heart rate, and on the right, the change in HRV in response to training of different intensities. So we have here that after training of higher intensity, the change in resting heart rate is what you see here. So resting heart rate is a bit higher. We know that higher heart rate is higher stress, but this change in percentage is maybe 1% or less. So it's a tiny change. It's very difficult then on a day-to-day basis to use this for actionability because it's just such a small change that is smaller than the normal day-to-day variation you have, regardless of training. For HRV, we normally have a larger relative change, which simply means that this parameter is more sensitive to stress. So it's easier to understand when there is more stress on the body. When we look at people of different age groups, we also have that looking at HRV, we have that the response is consistent for people that are 20 or that are 60. For heart rate, instead the change reduces over time. This means that if you're older, it's even more difficult to use heart rate to guide training because the change is very small. While if we look at HRV, we can always use it to capture changes in response to training. So it becomes more sensitive, but also less impacted by other things like aging. Here we have traveling. So another example in which we have 1 month of frequent traveling, intercontinental traveling, and 1 month without traveling. And again, HRV is much lower when traveling. There is a higher stress on the body. So here I just want to keep showing you a couple of examples in which we can see how the data captures different forms of stress. Alcohol intake is also a big one. We have here changes that are 4 or 5 times larger than what we saw with respect to training. So this tells us already that we cannot use these tools if we don't have an approach that is, let's say, a more holistic approach also in terms of lifestyle, because if there is always high alcohol intake, then we will have large suppressions and impairment in physiology that will have nothing to do with how we are training or responding to training, but will just be associated to our lifestyle. Here's another one that I showed actually just a few minutes ago about getting sick. One of the largest stressors for getting sick, as well as for alcohol, the changes in heart rate are also very large, similar to the ones in HRV. So in these cases, I think both metrics are similarly effective, while for training, for traveling, and also for the menstrual cycle, HRV becomes more useful because it better reflects these changes. In case of the menstrual cycle, typically we have during the luteal phase, so second part of the cycle, a reduction in HRV. So I think it's important to know that, because if you track, then you might see these changes and you might try to associate them to something else, but it's just normal change that is associated most likely to the other hormonal changes that are happening during the cycle. The same analysis can be analyzed in the app. So looking at different stressors and how they impact your physiology over a longer period of time, so that you can try to see if these relationships also show up in your own data. This is all to say again that stress comes from different sources, right? So we have training, but there is a lot more than training, and all of that has an impact because we can only take so much stress. Here I have an example where we can see how the relationship between training and HRV disappears due to other stressors. Here we have HRV data from a person. This is a marathon runner in Spain. We see the data looks towards the higher end of the normal range. This is typically a good sign. Then this in March 2020, so at the beginning of the pandemic, lockdown starts, training stops, and HRV goes down. Obviously here there's a lot of concerns at the beginning and there is no training. So the suppression is really not a response, a negative response to training, but it's psychological stress and other issues, which actually get better only when things slightly renormalize over summer. So I think this is something important to remember. Stress is training and lifestyle, and all of that will be reflected in measures of physiological stress like HRV. If we want to collect some data so that we can start looking at these relationships, there are different methods. Apart from collecting accurate data, I think it's important also to talk a little about collecting meaningful data, which means typically at the right time, because if I was to measure my HRV now, it would not tell me anything useful about my baseline physiological stress level. It would just be altered because I'm talking and things like that, but it's not really meaningful. So it's important to collect it at a meaningful time. And then I'll talk a bit about how we interpret that data. So how do we collect this accurate data? There are different ways. At HRV4Training, we have developed this method to use the phone camera. So we have validated this at High Performance Sports in New Zealand, which means that we have been looking at collecting data through the phone camera and through chest straps and ECGs, so electrocardiograms with electrodes that you place on the chest. Here is a minute of data where you can see the 3 signals between the polar strap, the camera, and the ECG that are overlapped basically perfectly, and that shows how you can capture the same signals. These variations over a minute, this is typically what happens just with when relaxing with breathing. So as you breathe in and breathe out, your heart rate is modulated, and you can see that quite clearly here. This as one of the participants in the study. And you can see here, again, the relationship between HRV computed with the camera and with the ECG, which is the same across a very broad range of values. So again, these are methods that I think today is well accepted. You can measure HRV accurately. A few years ago, it was a bit more difficult to convince people, but I think eventually now it's quite obvious. There are other ways to measure. You don't have to use the phone camera or this app. So there are a few things that we recommend. There are not so many that are not chest straps that are good, but still a few, like the Scotch Rhythm 24 is an armband that you can put in HRV mode and it will give you accurate data. The Apple Watch can be used as well, as long as you use it to take a measurement in the morning using the Breathe app. Otherwise, it automatically collects some data points at random times, and that's problematic. Even when it does it in the night, it is not particularly useful, and show that in a second. But yeah, so if you use it to measure in the morning, then it is very accurate. That's no problem. Polar straps, typically the best. Garmin straps also work well, the recent ones via Bluetooth. And yeah, that's pretty much it. For night measurements, well, I said I advise Aura, but in general, I recommend Aura because they provide the full night of data. And that's very important. If you have just a few data points in the night, then you cannot really estimate this baseline physiological stress level I was talking about. And I want to show you the reason why that is the case. So we cannot just collect a few minutes of data in the night and then use that to compute HRV. The reason is that during the night, even though we are unconscious, a lot of things happen. The autonomic nervous system is very active. So there is the circadian rhythm, which means that your HRV changes throughout the night, right? So you can just think about your resting heart rate typically is something that we are more used to track. The resting heart rate will reduce throughout the night. Your HRV similarly will increase a bit. And then there are sleep stages. So every 30 seconds or so, if you're in a different sleep stage, your HRV can change dramatically. And I can show you these changes here. We have that HRV jumps a lot up and down throughout the night, to the point that if you were to use an Apple Watch or another device that is measuring the HRV only a few minutes per night, and you were measuring at this point or at this point, you will get very different results just because there is this variability throughout the night. So if instead you look at the full average of the night, you can see clearly that these two nights are different. So that's why I recommend using a device that allows you to track the entire night of data or to measure first thing in the morning. These two measurements are basically equivalent. I'll show you some data about that as well. But if you use a device that tracks during the night and collects random data points, automatically collected every few minutes or every hours, that is going to be problematic because simply there is too much variability throughout the night. If you have arrhythmias or your athletes have arrhythmias, that is another reason why it's better to use morning measurements, because the night's data will be impacted and you will not know. HRV will be much higher than it actually is, not because parasympathetic activity is higher, but just because there are artifacts in the data. So if you measure in the morning, typically, as long as you're not having arrhythmia as you measure, or you just have an atopic beat and not too many disruptions, then it's always feasible to measure your HRV. If your arrhythmia is present for every few seconds, you have some disruptions in heart rhythm, then it might just not be possible to track HRV. If you measure in the morning, the important thing is just to try to do it before you do anything else, because of the nature of what we measure, which is autonomic nervous system activity. Anything will affect it. So if you have coffee or you have exercise, or even if you read your email or something else that upsets you or excites you, that will have a transitory effect that will have an impact on the data. So it does not make sense to do that and then measure. in those few minutes in which your physiology is altered. But it's better to just wake up, still relaxed, take your measurement, and that will give you a reliable snapshot of your baseline physiology. In terms of the measurement, the easiest, I think, is to do it when you are still in bed in the morning. If that's not possible because of any reason, from small kids to dogs or other things to do, it is totally fine to have a slightly different routine with respect to the one listed here. So if you go to another room, sit there and take your measurement, totally fine, as long as you try to do that always in the same way. So do not lie down one day and sit the other day. That would create inconsistencies in the data that make it noisy and not really reflective, again, of this baseline physiological stress. So it's important, more than the exact routine, it is important to try to do it always in the same way. If you do it in the same way, then it will represent baseline physiological stress in a better way, and it will allow you to use this data to capture changes in response to what you're doing. Ideally, you would measure daily. If you forget or cannot do it daily, I would say at least 4 or 5 times per week, give you enough data to capture longer term changes in response to stress, if not all the day-to-day acute changes, because you're missing some data. Here is again on the morning and night. There was a paper just published 2 weeks ago showing how morning and night measurements are actually extremely similar, provided that they are done in a certain way. And that's what I just talked about. So in the night, we use the full night, not just a few minutes. And in the morning, we measure as soon as you wake up in a rested state. If you do one of the two, then it's fine. They are going to represent the same changes in physiology. They are not interchangeable, right? So you cannot measure one day in the night and one day in the morning. But if you pick one of the two consistently, then you will see the same trends over time. My recommendation is therefore to just pick what works for you. There are obviously trade-offs, right? Devices that measure in the night are more expensive. You need to wear something. If you measure in the morning, sometimes you don't need anything but your phone. At the same time, if you forget every day, then you're not getting any data. So a wearable might be better. So depending on what works for you, either of them are equally good, provided that, again, you try to follow the best practices that I covered. Now I want to show you some data. A couple of things. At the beginning, I said that increased HRV is associated with lower stress. That is in general true, but we have moved away a bit from that simplistic understanding of physiology towards something where we look at what we call your normal values or your normal range, basically to try to determine what is an optimal range of value for you in your physiology, so that when you're inside that range of values, we assume that basically everything is normal and you're responding well to different stressors. And if you're outside of the range, then something is off and there could be more stress, or it might be time for adjustments. You can think a bit about blood pressure. Too high or too low is what we don't consider ideal. And then there is this optimal range. The difference here is that for blood pressure, we still use these population ranges that are supposed to be good for everyone. For HRV, it is certainly not that way. So this normal range is only for you. And it's something that the tool you use will determine over time. Like the app we use will use about 60 days in HRV4Training to determine what is normal, and then determine again if on a given day you are outside of your normal range, meaning that stress is significantly higher. Let's see. Yeah. So the whole point of this is that when you track HRV, you don't track HRV to improve HRV itself. So this may be sometimes a common misconception. It's especially for people that might be athletes of any level, recreational to professional, and you already take care of your sleep, of your diet, your exercise, and all of that. Your HRV most likely is within the same range over months or years. It's not going to get much different from that. But what you use is HRV on a daily basis as a feedback loop so that you can make some adjustments and basically try to keep it more consistent over time. And what you improve is then health and performance, not HRV itself. HRV is just what you use to try to track these changes in stress and make adjustments. Here is an example of how we show these normal values and this normal range is basically this band that you see here. You can see that there is a lot of variability in HRV between consecutive days. So this concept of the normal range makes it much easier to interpret the data, because if you look, for example, here, and over a week, the data goes up and down all the time. So if you go from this day to this day and you have quite a suppression, in the previous, I would say, some years ago, you would have thought, okay, HRV has reduced quite a bit from yesterday. Maybe I need to worry today, or I need to lower the intensity or make some changes in my training. But that is not really the case, because this is basically noise. This day-to-day variability that is still within your range is not saying anything that is particularly meaningful, because it simply reflects the fact that everything is, again, within your normal range. So there are no changes in physiology that are, I think, worth mentioning when everything is within this range. When things go outside of this range, acutely, like here, for just a given day, or chronically, like here, with the baseline that goes below normal, then we know that there is significant stress on the body, and that's a good time to implement some changes. This is also what state-of-the-art research does these days. So they use the concept of the normal range, and then when you have a deviation from that, and you are in a phase of significant stress, then you would implement changes. For example, again, reduced training intensity typically is really the one change that is done in most studies, because the intensity of the stimulus is what will create the biggest disruption more than anything else. Here I have a year of data for a triathlete that I think is quite interesting, because it shows the physiological response to many events. For example, here we start again, so we see also the normal range that changes over time. This is also important because the normal range, as I said, we build it using 60 days of data, and we always update it because there are changes in physiology just due to seasonality, right? So in summer, for example, your heart rate normally is a bit lower and the HRV is a bit higher. So we don't want to use data you collected in winter to give you advice in summer. That's why this data is always updated continuously, using a time frame long enough so that still we rely on what we think is a representative snapshot of your physiology, like 2 months. Because if we were to use, say, just 2 weeks, then when you're in a period of high stress, like here, after a bike accident and broken wrist, then this would become already your normal, because you're in a suppression for several weeks. But instead, we need to be able to see and detect that here it's a suppressed state for that long, because there was a large chronic issue, basically, that took some time to recover. Here we have done consistent training and data that looks particularly good. We have an altitude training camp, which is a situation in which typically we have an acute suppression. We can see here, the daily scores are all pretty low, and the baseline also goes down below the normal values. Then the camp is over and going back to sea level, and the data jumps back up. This, I would say, an ideal response. If the stimulus was maybe too much, then you would see more of a struggle here after the camp in terms of how the data bounces back to normal, while this increase shows a very good response from this athlete. Then we have stress due to work, and we can see here also a very long period of values that are very low and below normal. So once again, it's not just training, right? It's training and lifestyle stress, and in particular, HRV tells you what is the response to the stressor, not the stimulus, right? So here there can be massive training, but we have a great response because the athlete is doing well. While here we have a situation of negative response to psychological stress and work stress, and we have very low values. So I think that's also what is interesting and not always well understood. What we look at is really the response, not the stimulus itself. So if we have a negative response, it means that something did not go well in how we have tried to absorb or manage the stimulus. Here we have finally the race, and then a period of sickness in which the values are lower. All right, here is another one where we have, again, a period of normal training and consistent aerobic training. These phases are actually associated with stable or increased HRV. So again, training is not supposed to sink your HRV unless you are responding poorly, because maybe you're doing something that is a mismatch with your current fitness. So as long as everything is working well, you should see a stable or positive response. And then we have the usual stressors that sometimes we cannot just avoid, traveling for work. And then we have a lot of suppressions here, days with very low scores, and the baseline also going below the race. And after the race, we have values a bit all over the place. It's also quite typical in terms of a response in which then there is just more difficulty in stabilizing the physiological response after a particularly hard event. Another one here with training and lifestyle, we have increased training load here. So in orange, we have the acute load above the blue one, which is the chronic. This is simply meaning that it's a period in which there is particularly high training load. We have a very good response with HRV above normal values. And then we have a period of increased work stress and then HRV sinking. So for each of us, stressors differ depending on what is it that stresses us negatively, let's say, that causes a poor response, and that what is reflected in the data. That's why we need to look at this, again, holistically, looking at what different aspects of life and not only training, and try to see how we can use all of this information and context to figure out what is causing changes and where can we make adjustments so that we try to maintain the data within our optimal zone all the time. This an example with the menstrual cycle, this heart rate data. So you have that during the luteal phase, second part of the cycle. These are basically, this is the period, so menstruation days, and you have the increase in heart rate in the second phase of the cycle. You can see here that it's very cyclical. So for some people, this becomes the typical pattern that they see, sometimes even regardless of other stressors. So it's important to, again, know that these oscillations are due to the cycle, and then try to see how training and other stressors impact this data at that point. Sickness, one of the biggest stressors. This an elite triathlete, you can see how the data is always within the normal range. This typical response of an elite athlete. You almost never see baseline going outside of the normal range when everything goes well. And then here we have very large suppression due to sickness. Values are extremely low, also with respect to previous acute changes. There is a case of long COVID, which can cause an autonomic dysfunction. And then in this case, the suppression is not only the acute one, but then is long lasting. Finally, just a few words on training prescription. So we looked a bit at how we can acquire the data and the whole concept of the normal values. And when there is a suppression, we know that there is a stronger stressor. What can we do about it? So state-of-the-art research is using the same method and information to basically make some changes in terms of training prescription, which typically means reducing training intensity when the baseline is below normal values. So I should have probably here something visual. Yeah. So when you have a suppression of this type, typically you hold back, you do not do the intensity, and everything else that is positive adaptation or values within the normal range is something that basically where you continue as planned. It's important here to always remember that HRV does not guide the training to start with, meaning that you always start with a plan, and then with the plan you make adjustments based on your physiological response. It's not that you would always go hard until you sink your HRV and then you're in a state of chronic negative response to training, you would basically just always proceed as planned, even when HRV is good. If you have a day off or an easy day, perfect. Just keep going that way so that things remain in your optimal range. And then if for one reason or the other, the body is particularly stressed, again, due to poor response to training or any sort of other lifestyle stressor, then that is a good time to adjust training by reducing intensity, depending on the level of the athlete. Totally fine to train, even to do big volume at times, or to do some intensity, but less than what was planned. And yeah, in all the studies that I've looked into this so far, typically they see improvement in performance or in other physiological measures associated to performance when using this approach to guide training with respect to just the regular periodization. So that can be, I would say, a simple way to make some adjustments and try to be flexible on your workouts so that you can eventually benefit in the longer term. Yeah, the whole point is just that the timing of the stressor obviously matters, right? I think we can all understand that. Not every day it's the same. So providing that stimulus when you are in a better state to absorb it, it's supposedly ideal then for the longer term adaptation. HRV is just one parameter. It cannot track everything. There are things that are not reflected in HRV. The main one is probably muscle soreness. So that's why, again, starting with a plan and then looking at the physiological response, but also how the athlete is feeling subjectively, and training as context is, I think, the ideal way to look at this data, not to just rely on this, but always try to integrate it in everything else that you're using, and then try to benefit from an objective assessment of physiological stress. And that's what I have for today.
Thanks, Marco. That was, I basically wrote a big list of questions as we started for this, and I think you've pretty much covered nearly all of them there. So,
all right, good start.
But no, I will kick off with like a couple of questions or thoughts. The first one being my observation with athletes with monitoring HRV is it's about creating a good habit, because a lot of people have this app and sometimes they're using it and sometimes they're not. And they tend to gravitate towards to want to know what's going on when they're not in a good place. And the problem is, unless you have that consistent baseline, there's no way of tracking. And I hold my hand up to say, you know, I didn't really track it through the back end of last year. Start of this year, I've been under a lot of training load, and you know, you feel tired some days. I've been tracking it, and very much actually like your slides were saying, actually, I haven't really had any changes in HRV, and I've been coping with high volume. Interestingly, I've just got sick this morning, and another thing you point out is I've heard, well, I don't know whether you mentioned it today, but I've certainly heard it mentioned, athletes with very low resting heart rates and high volume. I take my measurements lying down, and even this morning, I knew I was not well this morning, but I've not seen a change in my HRV or resting heart rate this morning. It still looked good. So I think I will probably, off the back of this, change the way I'm going to record it based off my physiology.
Yeah, you make a good point there. I think in general, yeah, we say, you know, keep it simple, measure while lying down. But as you say, if you have a very low heart rate and you are under a very high volume of training, sometimes it can be beneficial to just add a little stress, which means measuring while sitting or standing. Sitting maybe is easier. You have to be less patient. Let's say if you stand up, then you have to wait also a minute, which feels like forever in the morning. So it's a bit easier if you sit down. Add a little stressor, and then basically the response is a bit amplified in a way that you might be able to better capture these stressors, even in a situation in which maybe your HRV is reasonably high with respect to the population. Yeah, I just want to stress that it's a bit of a corner case, but important, especially maybe for your audience and people that, you know, do triathlon and train a lot and tend to have lowest heart rate. I think that's always a good point.
Yeah, I think just to be clear that you're talking about like very low heart rates there, though, aren't you? Not you know.
Yeah, in the 30s, like low 30s. If you are even at 40, 45, which is still very low for the population, I think it's still totally fine. But if you are maybe in the 30, 35, then I think sitting is a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm just going to start with that. I've just been WhatsApped a question from an athlete who's, well, he's doing it right. He's on the turbo sending messages, asking questions. So bear with me a second. Yeah, I mean, he's sort of asking this question, which you covered late on in the slideshow, which is discussing when he wakes up on a day that suddenly he's got a very low heart rate. You know, should he adapt his plan or stick to the plan? You know, should he respond to acute changes, or more look for, you know, or are chronic changes actually something more that, you know, has more importance in changing your plan?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question that does not have a very clear answer based on the research. But I think that's one of the things where the research is limited, and let's say applied and practical settings are more important sometimes. And what I mean is that in research, we can say, okay, let's just look at the chronic changes, and then we ignore every other change for now. But then maybe one day you're sick. So what do? You keep going for like 3-4 days because you want your baseline to sink. And of course you cannot do that. And, you know, if you're sick, you know already that it's not going to be a day for intervals or anything like that. So we do need that level of flexibility. And I think we don't need to be super reactive to acute changes. So if you feel great, then I think it's fine to train, even to do whatever you had planned if your HRV is suppressed, as long as the day after you see that it bounces back to normal. So it was just that, maybe any sort of stressor that caused that suppression that was not important because you bounce back quickly. But if you don't feel good and then you have an acute suppression, then I think it's not particularly smart to just wait for days until, you know, your chronic change is reflected, just because by the nature of a chronic change, it's going to take days. And you might know already that you're not feeling well. So I think we always need to combine a bit the two. The longer term chronic changes are more important, and that's what should be what we rely on, not to be too reactive. I think it's also not particularly healthy to be too reactive to all these metrics that we track, you know, from sleep scores to HRV to whatever is it that we are looking at. It's good to maybe keep some distance and look more at the big picture over time. But they can also flag things again like sickness, and we should always try to relate what we see with how we feel and try to work with those more than replace our subjective feeling with objective data, which is what some end up doing.
Yeah, I think this like leads on to the next thing I was thinking was, we obviously work with athletes in a long-term process to make them better. The way I view this, and as I listen to all this, a few certain ones of my athletes spring to mind where I sort of go, oh, actually, I should use this with this guy to just monitor what happens. Because, for example, I might have an athlete working in a highly stressful job in the city. He has certain parts of the year that are incredibly stressful. Different people will absorb stress in different ways. You know, to some people, it won't impact their training. To others, it will. And actually, what we really want to measure is like trend over time and work out what it is that bothers the individual, isn't it? You know, and what if their heart rate variability doesn't change and their training is still trending in a good manner, even though they're going through what most other people would consider a stressful period in work or family life or whatever it is. It's about the person knowing themselves, and I think this tool allows them to do that. And that goes back to that initial point of measure all the time, because, and I'm not sure you meant, you know, but we use Training Peaks, and your app links straight into Training Peaks, doesn't it? And simply records the data in there as a, you know, something the coach can quickly look at, something the athlete can refer back to. I think it really helps identify those key periods, especially women. You know, we do a lot on like the menstrual stuff with the girls in the group. We've actually got something coming up, and our next talk is actually all on this in a few weeks' time. And I think there's a lot of good data to be gathered. Do you agree on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think, the fact that this is just reflecting the response more than the stressor itself, as you say, it allows you to see how different individuals respond to different stressors, and everybody is different. So for someone, some people might even thrive on certain stressful situations, and then you cannot just assume that there will be a certain response. That's why the data becomes useful, because you see how the individual responds. And then people tend to respond in similar ways also over time. The same person to the same stressors. So then it becomes a learning process. You see what works, what doesn't work, and you can make some changes there.
Yeah. And then another thing you touched on was the high training volume, or periods of very good training, i.e. when the athlete is becoming very fit, HRV values tend to rise. And actually, I see this as another good driver of motivation within an athlete. So knowing that, as well as we have other metrics we use with athletes that monitor fitness, but this is an actual physiological response within the body, simply saying, if, even though you might not have raced to test yourself or something, that your aerobic system is probably in a very, very good state if your HRV values are higher than they were, say, several months ago, and you can see it as a building trend. So, that, I think that's like another thing I've used with athletes before to sort of show how fitness is building.
Yeah, I think we can always see and appreciate that kind of change as the ideal response when training is going well. And yeah, it's sometimes counterintuitive, because we use HRV because it captures the stress response to training, but then that does not mean that training should sync your HRV. And as a matter of fact, most athletes, when they are in the off season, that they are training less, or let's say relaxing more, that's when their HRV is lower. And then as they build up, you will see the gradual increase as they reach their peak fitness. Things get to look very differently, and again, more as an increase than anything else.
I think one thing you can use that for, isn't it, is where a lot of age group triathletes, as I always put it, they're living on the edge. They are cramming as much into life as possible. And that, I always try and say to people, you shouldn't be at capacity. You should always have that little bit of wiggle room so that life isn't totally stressed out. And I think if most people monitored their HRV when they are trying to fit a million things into the day and as much training as possible, they might find actually by lowering the training a little bit, or lowering or skipping other things in life, like sitting on Instagram for an hour in the evening instead of just getting to sleep, they would see that their HRV would probably trend in a better state, wouldn't it? So
yeah, for sure. I think especially for all of us that are not professional athletes, these tools sometimes become more useful even than for professional athletes, because there is more going on, and you have to wake up at 5 to train, and everything piles up. So that becomes a useful objective parameter.
Yeah. And I suppose the last one of my notes I've got before I run out of things to say is, and it goes right back to that first question I asked from the athlete who sent me the message, is, do you react to a drop in HRV? And we discussed that, but I think one of the key messages is, don't stress an already stressed body, because actually you're probably wasting your time. No training plan is ever built or should ever be built without any flexibility in it. So it might be that you wake up one day and HRV is trending low, and you did have a stressy day the day before, and actually you go through the day and you do feel a bit tired. Is doing that big key workout of the week correct on that day, or do you move it 24 hours? And because actually what you're seeking is better adaptations to training, isn't it? Ultimately, that's what we're all listening to this call for, is how do we get faster at our sport? So that I'm probably right when I say that, am I?
Yeah, for sure. Very well said. I think that's the key aspect. I think that's why in training, this HRV is widely adopted despite being just an overall marker of stress, is typically because you can do something about it. You can change your training. So that's how we need to be flexible and make these changes, because obviously if there is huge stress at work or other sort of things, it might be much more difficult to actually do something about it at times. But with training, we can always be a bit flexible and make some changes that will allow to then apply the stimulus at the better time.
Yeah. Sorry, I've just thought of one more. This is one that always occurred to me. You obviously, I mean, I think the idea of using the camera lens on your phone is genius first thing in the morning. You know, I came from a cycling background 20 odd years ago where I took resting heart rate with a chest strap and there was no choice. It's what you did. I think one thing I found, and you might tell me, you know, this was just my phone or whatever. I had a phone that I had for quite a lot of years, and it obviously, I don't know, maybe the software was slightly out of date and the phone was certainly older. I'm sure the camera lens was probably scratched, the quality, you know. Is there an issue there with older model phones, or, you know, anything with a degraded lens on as to how?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question, because not all the phones are the same. So what we can support is pretty much every iPhone. So from the, I think still the 5 to the latest, I think is 13. All of them work very well. So because they're very standard, like basically they're all the same, even the new models, even if there are more cameras. On Android, that's a bit different. There is a million different combinations, so they just cannot be all tested. So there, basically we have a different algorithm that tells you if there is an issue. So that that way, if the phone is not supported, the app will tell you instead of providing some random data points. And then at that point, you need to use a sensor or we refund you. But there is just no way around it. Not all Android phones can be supported. So that's just how it is when basically you hack the hardware for this.
Yeah, good. Has anyone else got any other questions? Anyone that's on? Just checking the chat box.
Just going to reinforce what you were saying about consistency, Phil, in terms of changing training plans. That so my HRV is connected to my training peaks. First thing I do every morning consistently is to measure. Those days that I'm amber and I don't listen to it because actually I think it's a small minor change, lack of sleep, and I push through, typically it tends to lead to a second amber day. The day that I leave the feedback that says, actually, I'm going to listen to it, it tends to lead to a green day the next day. So definitely it's the consistency and measuring in the times where you're not necessarily looking for those changes that make the biggest impact to my consistency over sort of training long term. Obviously, you were saying that when people are ill, they typically then want to track and know because something's already gone wrong. To me, I already know that bit because actually my body feels that rubbish that I know illness has stopped me from training, but it is that other stress that, you know, training peaks doesn't pick up, like lack of sleep or stress through work, that when that amber shows, I do react to it. Try not to react too quickly, but yeah, typically that then leads to a second amber day if I don't react.
Yeah, it's good to hear. I think you know, I think we as a coaching business very much sort of like preach using many different metrics during training sessions, and I actually think that is the same when you are judging the condition of yourself to train. You know, HRV I think is like the scientific one to go to, asking yourself how you feel and being honest with yourself as to what's gone on. But I think with any of these tools, it's about how you use the education of what you're learning from the tools. So I mean, this has been great. I've learned loads tonight that will allow me to assess those numbers within the app a little bit better, and also think, you know, it will remind me, for example, to think not how, you know, what was I doing yesterday, what was even going on in the last couple of days, work wise, life wise, how have I slept the last few days, why do I feel the way I do today, and therefore should I continue down the path I was going to, or do I just make it an easier session? And then I think further to a post I put on our Facebook group yesterday, you know, talking about the importance of aerobic training. I think an awful lot of athletes could on an amber day actually just replace a hard session with an easier session and, you're still getting gains and probably allowing yourself to go green again the next day. And I think it's just combining it's why we do these talks, you know, that you're just building an athlete's education. And I know we as coaches believe that that's what you're primarily providing an athlete, is that enhancing their understanding of their own training. And I think this has been really, really fascinating tonight, Marco. So thanks so much for
good to hear. Thank you so much.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm just gonna not that I mean, we have no official tie-up with you guys. This is just a great tool. But I am actually, you know, there's no, in my view, no even sales side to this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your app is $9.99 on to download to get the free version, and the premium version with all of the enhanced data is €45 a year. Am I right?
That is correct.
Which is like next to nothing, you know, compared to, I hear people on our WhatsApp groups talking about buying £500 recovery boots, and they're probably typing that at 11 o'clock at night when they should be asleep. Hey, so this is like real small amounts of money. So bear with me 1 second. I just got a couple of other quick questions just come in here. Phil, are you actually on? Might be worth you asking that. Not sure if he is. Hang on.
Just said he can't speak. I've got the question out. Do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So he says, is there any data on HRV pre and post breath work? So acute changes due to sympathetic or parasympathetic responses to techniques. So things like the Wim Hof, or alternatively box breathing, etc., for relaxation.
In general, I would say there is evidence that there is a dramatic change as you do it, but I would not say acutely after. It's just as you do it. Even just deep breathing, if you do deep breathing, you stimulate parasympathetic nervous system, just the breathing rate will increase greatly your HRV, but that's happening as you do it. And once you're done, typically you are back to baseline values. I think, there's a fascinating area also in the context of training to see if you could somehow recover faster from at least nervous system point of view by doing certain practices associated to anything that is relaxation or deep breathing. But I think at this stage, there is no evidence that your physiology would also change. Anything that is based breathing or deep breathing or any other practice has, I would say, there is quite some evidence of the positive effect from different points of view in terms of anxiety and depression and sleep and other positive benefits. But that does not mean that it will impact your baseline physiology in a way that is measurable over time. So I would say up for debate and most likely highly individual. I find it interesting myself, but I don't think there is anything particularly strong in terms of the evidence we have so far that we can make any claims of changes in physiology due to that.
Yeah, I think like my view on anything like that, like yoga, relaxation techniques, cold water immersion. I mean, surely if you've had a very stressful week at work or there's other life stresses going on, anything you do that helps to counterbalance that is very simply just de-stressing, you know, because everything's a toss-up, isn't it? We all have stressful things happen within every day. I mean, you know, most of us drink too many cups of coffee. That's stressful. So yeah, I think anything that you find relaxing, and that could be sitting watching a film, playing golf, jumping in cold water, it's anything that helps that, isn't it, really? That's probably, you know, anecdotally good. I think Phil's just got another question here as well. Yeah, this is quite good. Can we use HRV after training to confirm whether a session was as easy as intended or as hard as intended, based on the changes in HRV in the hours after a session?
Yeah, I think that's really a great question. Something that has been interesting me a lot in the past months, based on some research that Steven Seiler did 15 years ago. So it seems so that you can measure before and after. And after means right after, and maybe after 5 minutes and 10 minutes, up to 30 minutes. It's a bit of work and also not very practical, because after training, maybe you drink something or eat, and it's not so easy because all of those things will impact the data. If you are able to track it, it seems there are very different responses after aerobic training and after anything that is not aerobic training. So if you train at a low intensity, your HRV after training should be the same as before, or even increased. So even a few minutes after training, despite the stress of training, you might have maybe 20-30% higher HRV than before training. So this has been shown in Steven's research, but also in some data that we collected recently. I think it's fascinating to see some of these changes that maybe you would not expect. And as soon as you're a bit outside of that low intensity training, then you have a different response in which you just have a suppression that slowly over time will renormalize. So it could be a way to check that you're actually working at that low intensity or not overdoing it in a way.
Yeah, an interesting conversation that's ongoing in the sport at the moment, especially with it amongst our lot. And you could use blood lactate during threshold sessions to make sure you stay just on the right side of your threshold and you're not passing your threshold. I suppose another way to monitor that would be, if you were, let's say for argument, an athlete has a bike threshold at 300 watts and you do all your high aerobic intervals at 270, 280, if you're not seeing a decrease in HRV immediately after training, and then try, you monitor this for a period, but then monitor trying it at 300 or even over at 310, I wonder whether there is, correlation with a decrease in HRV in the, subsequent hours based on overcooking a session, which is, something that we go on about an awful lot. The fact that it's about quite often just being slightly under where you think you should be rather than slightly over. But in triathlon, this A-type personality that is attracted always wants to slightly beat the numbers and always push on. And actually it's nearly it's sort of counterintuitive to what you're trying to get out of your training, I think. So, but
yeah, for sure. I think that's always the biggest challenge, not racing your workouts. So I don't know if we can get to that level of information with the post measurement, but for sure for the low intensity work, it can be helpful there.
I'm sure we'll have some data geeks listening that'll go off on a little one and find that one out for you. So, brilliant. Anything else from you guys, Kit or Kirsty, or are we?
No, I just want to say thank you very much. I've learned lots. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
No, really good. And just, anyone that wants to take this further, speak to your coach. Most of the coaches are well versed. The app is easy to find, HRV4Training, and the website's full of good information. I sent an email out on the Facebook group earlier, just, with even just having a read through how all of their ambassadors use it, I think is quite fascinating to just give you ideas as to what people are tracking in the metrics from it. So brilliant, Marco. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thanks, everyone.